Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. It's so amazing to be holding this session in person after kind of the years of the COVID disruption. So welcome. I hope you enjoyed the reception last night. Got to have a reunion with some people or meeting people for the first time if this is your first meeting. So we particularly want to welcome the newcomers to SWS. There are people in the room. Please, if you would like, move forward so we can kind of engage and see your faces. That would be great. We're also welcoming those who are joining us by live stream. So wherever you are in the world, welcome as well. So my name is Emmanuel, faculty in Women and Gender Studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and I'll be moderating the book salon today on Normativities, Racialization, and Social Justice. So I'd like to thank Ghassan Moussaoui, Steph Schuster, and Barrett Katuna for organizing this session, the first of 4 book salons of the meeting. And last year, for the first time, SWS offered several of these book salon sessions as part of the programming for the winter meeting. So following the big success of these book salons, we're excited to be offering them again as part of our winter program. So the salons offer an opportunity for the SWS community to learn more about new and exciting work that focuses on gender and intersectionality, to have authors highlighted in each session, to be in conversation with one another, and to create community around our common interest in scholarly work relating to gender. So each salon features 3 books. They're pictured here behind us. In one 90-minute session. And so we'll be engaging in a discussion with the authors and then opening it up at the end for a Q&A with the audience. So we'll be ending, it says on the program, it'll be 90 minutes, but it'll be just a little bit shorter because we need a little time before the plenary session, which requires some setup for the translation. So even though it says we'll end at 9:45, we'll try to end around 9:30, 9:35. So we can still accomplish a lot in that amount of time. So I think we can dive right in, and I'll begin by introducing our authors in the order in which they appear on the program. So our participants today, on our left, where did it go? Chris Barcelos is an assistant professor of women's gender sexuality studies, affiliate faculty in critical ethnic and community studies and Latino studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Professor Barcelos is a feminist scholar and educator working in the fields of gender and sexuality studies, public health, and sociology. Their work combines critical race theory and critical sexuality studies with community-based research to analyze public health efforts. Their book, Distributing Condoms and Hope, The Racialized Politics of Youth Sexual Health, was published in 2020 with University of California Press. Our next panelist or speaker is Nora Taplin-Kaguru, an assistant professor of sociology at Earlham College. Welcome. She's an urban sociologist studying racism, housing, the built environment, and social media. She also has been published in City and Community. Her book, published in 2021 with Routledge, is Grasping for the American Dream, Racial Segregation, Social Mobility, and Homeownership. And our third panelist today is part of an author that published this edited collection, Black Feminist Sociology, Perspectives and Praxis, published by Routledge in 2022. Zakiya Luna. Zakiya Luna is Associate Professor of Sociology and Dean's Distinguished Professorial Scholar at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research, teaching, and community work are in the areas of social movements, human rights, and health. Her research on the reproductive justice movement includes this book here. Reproductive Rights as Human Rights, Women of Color and the Fight for Reproductive Justice with NYU. And Professor Luna's collaboration was with Whitney Laster-Pirtle, as well as 2 student editorial assistants, Jasmin Kelekay and Tashelle Wright. So the way this will work today is I will pose some questions to our authors. Hopefully they'll respond with their thoughts in response to those questions, and we'll engage in a dialogue about their exciting work. So please join me with a round of applause and a congratulations to our authors here. So why don't we begin by asking our authors a simple question, hopefully. What is your book about?
How's my mic? Good. This is actually a really hard question, but thank you for being here this morning. This is the first time I've gotten to do an in-person book event because my book was a pandemic baby. So this is super exciting because, you imagine doing all these things and they were on Zoom like everything else. So my book is about a lot of things. It's an ethnography of community-based public health in the United States. But at the center of it is tracing how the discourses of race, reproduction, and science play out in the youth sexual health promotion efforts of a economically marginalized, predominantly Puerto Rican city in the US Northeast that I call Millerston in the book. And the city is a place that's overdetermined as a site of numerous health, social, and educational inequalities, at the center of which are pregnant and parenting young Latinas. So the city has been known for many, many years as the place with the Latina teen pregnancy problem. And I had worked in community-based public health for several years in the city before going back to school to start a PhD program. After that time, when I was in graduate school, I then started doing the ethnographic work that became this book. So this was doing interviews with policymakers, elected officials, health educators, clinicians, health and human service providers, and doing participant observation at the many different kinds of community-based public health initiatives and coalitions and trainings and so forth that were happening in the city at the time as a result of a large CDC-funded grant. And I also interviewed pregnant and parenting young women at a school for a community-based GED program for pregnant and parenting young people and facilitated basically like consciousness raising groups there. So when I think about what the book is about, it's about uncovering how community health programs are a site where inequality is both revealed and reproduced. And it's about promoting individual level solutions for structural level problems. And a way to say that a little bit more snarkily is it's about white women behaving badly. So a lot of it is tracing the way that people with power and privilege work outside of this particular city and come to this city as a way of establishing professional careers by regulating the sexuality, reproduction, and education of economically marginalized youth of color. I'll stop there.
Okay, great, thank you. Next panelist.
Hi, so my book, is this? A little closer. So my book is about working class Black homebuyers in Chicago, navigating a landscape of racial segregation in the pursuit of home ownership. And the title, Grasping for the American Dream, really comes from something that was a bit of a surprise to me. I wasn't really expecting the book to be about the American dream, and it ended up being really, really central to it. And basically, what I look at is how working class Black homebuyers enter into a market, which is a racially structured market that disadvantages them. It's an exploitative market, and how the American dream ideology operates to encourage participation in this exploitative market. So basically, the American dream acts as a tax on Black homebuyers and on Black families. And I also sort of have a thread in the book that ended up being more about gender than I ever expected it to be. I interviewed 68 homebuyers from 65 different households. So there were a few households where I did interview two members of the household. together, but mostly I interviewed individuals, and some of those were women purchasing, many of those were women purchasing on their own, and some were women in multi-generational families, and some were women in heterosexual partnerships. But what I found was that even in coupled households, I oftentimes had women who were more involved in the home buying process. So we're in that sense, kind of more involved in this process of entering into a racially discriminatory market, but also lots of female-headed households. And this also came into play in terms of thinking about the American dream ideology and what it means for Black families. One of the things that the homebuyers I was talking to were negotiating was what it meant to be in a multi-generational home, and there are ways in which that is stigmatized in our society. And so, when I speak about sort of the choice to enter into homeownership when it is a discriminatory market, one of the alternatives is to stay in multi-generational homes that are already owned by the family. And oftentimes it is that American dream ideology that encourages people to sort of once again enter a market that they have seen their families in the past be disadvantaged by.
Thank you, Professor Taplin-Kaguru and Professor Lunas.
Yes,
What's your book about?
thank you so much. And I just want to also say how exciting it is to be here in person. A couple of years ago, when my first book was coming out, and it was also a pandemic baby, I really want to thank SWS for allowing me and a couple other people to put together the inaugural salons so that there was a space for us to connect around these texts that we weren't going to be able to do the traditional sort of book talks and things around. And it's just personally gratifying to see folks here supporting each other with that work. So I just want to put that out there. And Black Feminist Sociology as a edited volume. Let's see, technically, so what we have on our website and the little blurb we say is that, the goal is to bring together a diverse set of established and emerging scholars for a timely, accessible, and intellectually stimulating conversation regarding the foundations and the state of Black feminist sociology. That's pretty simple, but also for us, it was so important and revolutionary at the time we were developing it, because we also had this goal of engaging with 3 questions around, like, what is Black feminist sociology, right? What are the guiding principles that really, and theories and methods and practical applications of it? And what are the risks and rewards for practicing Black feminist sociology? And for us, it was about putting together a volume that answered those questions to some degree, but also that used a Black feminist process in producing the knowledge. And I'll talk more about that, but for me and for all of us, like, the book isn't only about the content, it was about the process and giving some other folks potential models to think about how you produce work for the academy and beyond. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. So we have these 3 amazing projects and scholars here making connections to, as Professor Luna just mentioned, models for people in the room, for students, for other researchers. Maybe we can use that as our segue into our next question. So thinking about models or theories, how does your work connect to gender theories or theories of gender that help us understand from a sociological perspective? We can go in this order, other order, it's up to you.
I'm just going to order.
Okay.
So at the heart of my book is the reproductive justice vision, framework, and social movement. So for those who aren't familiar, in brief, reproductive justice reframes this singular focus on access to abortion and contraception in movements often headed and visioned by white cisgender women. And so reproductive justice is not just access to abortion, but access to having the families we want and parenting them with dignity and support. And yet a lot of reproductive justice scholarship still kind of focuses on the not getting pregnant or being pregnant part of that equation. So this book is focusing on teen pregnancy and parenting within the context of community-based public health to really think about that third part of reproductive justice, which is what does it actually look like to choose the families we want and parent them with dignity and support. So it is, asks a lot of, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, I think. So teen parents are one of those social groups that is always already racialized, always already vilified, even among some feminist activists and scholars, right? So teen parents get to be the scapegoat for a lot of social problems, and that's not just among people who are politically progressive or politically left. So writing against the idea of teen pregnancy as this horrific social problem is always a little bit, involves a lot of tensions. So that was really important to me, although I did, as I talk about in the book, and if we're going to talk about methods later, I sort of took the focus a little bit off the pregnant and parenting teens themselves and onto this sort of formation that I call the teen pregnancy prevention industrial complex. So it's a way of naming the relationships among federal grant-making agencies, community-based organizations, individuals, and so forth, to name and trace the way that power sort of moves around within the community health nonprofit industrial complex. So the focus is a little bit less on the young mothers themselves, and I'll talk more about that in methods, I think. Yeah, what's up there?
Yeah, so I think one author that I was drawing on a lot was Dawn Marie Dow, with her work that sort of looks at the intersection of race, gender, and class. And I think that that's really important for kind of thinking about really what I ended up looking at a lot in my work was a kind of respectability politics in a certain kind of way, in terms of how people were thinking about representing themselves, their identities, and what it meant to be a homeowner, and sort of what homeownership brought to that was very much tied to representations of oneself as gendered, race, and classed. And then I also thought a lot about Matthew Desmond's claim that sort of eviction is a counterpart to mass incarceration for Black women. So sort of that eviction is almost the equivalent for Black women as mass incarceration for Black men, and thinking about that in terms of how having a tradition of female-headed households makes Black women more vulnerable to specific kinds of exploitations through our racially structured housing market, and how that operates even for lower middle class home buyers, obviously on a very different kind of scale, in different ways, but that it is also gendered.
So our volume, because it's based in Black feminist sociology, is really engaging in multiple ways with gender theory, and there's a next question about intersections. But I will take a step back and just say that for us, part of the impetus for the book was that the New Black Sociologist had just come out from ABS. And I remember sort of seeing the volume and wondering like, oh wait, where's the Black feminist equivalent? Because I had read Black feminist anthropology literally 15 years ago, that edited volume. There was a book on like Black feminist archaeology that had come out a year prior. And I thought it was interesting that there wasn't, and I was like, maybe I'm just mistaken. And I asked around at the conference, we're like, no, like we don't know of a specific volume that is Black feminist sociology. And certainly some people would argue that that's because Black feminist thought has been so well integrated into sociology, right? So there's no need. And yeah, right. That wasn't the reality. And so for us, part of it was making visible the continuous sort of invisible labor that is due to race, gender, sexuality, sort of hierarchies, all of that, and the role of Black women in the discipline. And there's different ways, like the authors within the text engage with that, and some of them engage explicitly with gender theory. Some of them are like, guess what? We're not going to engage with that because it's not actually speaking to our communities and the ways that we understand the work that we're doing. And part of our goal was to make space for that because Black feminist sociology can handle those tensions in ways that some other areas seem to be unable to sort of manage. And so there isn't just one way that sort of gender theory comes up in the text. There's multiple ways, and sometimes they're in disagreement. And we think that's sort of part and parcel of Black feminist approaches of being able to sort of hold that tension. So.
Okay, and you gave a preview of a next question. Yes. We're focusing on intersections. Would you like to follow up on that next part, and maybe we can go this way? So
sure.
Our next question is what intersections, broadly defined, inform your book? So
yeah, and I think for many people, like the obvious one is like, okay, so we're talking about Blackness, we're talking about feminist approaches. That means we're necessarily talking about women. Not necessarily, right? That was something that was important for us in the book. We're also talking about disability, although I want to be upfront, and we talk about this in the introduction, that our process in which we got like these 80 edited or 80 abstracts, and we had a process which I can talk more about, but thankfully, once we had narrowed down, we sent it to a couple more senior scholars in the field. Thank you, Joyce Bell and Nikki Jones, for taking a look and to see like what we were sort of missing. And Nikki was like, I don't see anything here on disability. And we were like, of the 80 abstracts we got, no one submitted anything related to disability. And there were some areas that we had like 10 things where they were abstracts submitted by different authors, right? So that to me sort of speaks to also like the intersections that aren't at most front of mind for many folks and what that means for the continuing work to do. There is some discussion of nation, and you know, I think we see this as a starting place, and we hope that there's folks who read this and are, yes, inspired, but are also like, wait a second, what about X? How about this and that, you know, and that there's additional volumes that sort of further engage with different intersections, let's say. Yes, so I'm gonna turn it over to my colleagues.
A follow-up question. So in terms of process, you also had, you put a call out, right? And we had this kind of huge response in terms of the number of submissions, and kind of you made some decisions, and then.
And that was, for us, that was part of like method, which I was thinking about talking a little bit more about that in that section. But yeah, it's interesting that a call for abstracts that got 80 submissions from around the world, that like disability wasn't present. And thankfully the person who Nikki Jones recommended and we reached out to was like, okay, I'll do something. But that also to me speaks to like the areas of work that continue to need to be, you know, engaged with. So.
Yeah, and also potential for future volumes.
Absolutely.
And future work. Yeah,
absolutely.
Great. Thank you. Yes, next.
Yeah. So I'd say that really at the core of my book is the intersection of race and class. The home buyers that I was interviewing were really at this kind of stage of trying to solidify middle class status. And home ownership is just so much tied to that, not just in the material sense, but the material sense matters too. And I talk to people a lot about that and what their hopes and dreams were for what this home was going to mean for their family in the long term. And that's where you know, some of the issues around our racist housing market become really, especially sort of materially problematic for people is, you know, the stability that the home is supposed to bring that it doesn't always bring. And the kind of precarity of middle-class status for Black families is so tied to the housing market. And that was a lot about what I was talking to people about, but then it also has implications for a sense of citizenship, for a sense of social standing in our society. And those were the kinds of things that I was really trying to explore and expand on with this book, was that kind of social meaning of home ownership for Black families. And that also ends up being tied to, as I was saying, these kinds of classed expressions of gender as well, classed and race. So in a way, it does all end up kind of being together. There's these tensions that surround all of those things.
And I recall you mentioned like the intersection of race and class, and also the vast majority of your interviews were with women, and you had this powerful vignette with, is it Tiffany, who opens the book, and like this kind of, you know, in her words, what that aspiration looks like and that desire, and kind of it goes full circle at the end in terms of Tiffany's story. And I don't know if you were planning to talk about.
Yeah, I could talk about Tiffany's story. So, so I opened the book talking about Tiffany, who, you know, I interviewed in this apartment that she was renting in Bronzeville, and she was renting it using a housing choice voucher, but she was just kind of coming up to the income limit. She'd been doing better in terms of income and work, and you know, had aspirations for owning a home herself. She'd grown up in a home that her parents owned in a suburb of Chicago that had experienced a lot of white flight and subsequent issues in terms of home values, retail redlining, which then in turn has issues for tax implications for the tax base, resources for schools, these kinds of things. And so she had seen that neighborhood change. She said her mother still lived in that home, and she felt like her mother had really experienced this great loss, and wished that her mother had gotten out of there sooner. And so that's all in the back of her mind as she's deciding whether or not to go into homeownership herself. Thinking about that whole legacy of her family, and having this desire, thinking of it as being important for having a particular kind of class standing. Thinking about it, she had a son, thinking about what it meant for her family going forward, but at the same time also thinking about what it meant for her family going forward, and being concerned about this precarity. So it was very much tied to that particular race and class and gendered social position.
And what I love about all of these books are how they're, in many ways, they're grounded in kind of the empirical, you know, realities of people's lives. So, I mean, it is about theory, but it's also about like how people experience the world. So the data is actually really illuminating and amazing. So thank you. Dr. Barcelos?
Yes, this question is such a big question, and I was you know, thinking about it, preparing to come here. And I was thinking about something that a mentor of mine, Joya Misra, said at a conference many years ago, which was that all intersections matter, but some of them are more salient in the particular situation that you're researching. And so, in answering this question, I think I'm going to focus on kind of two things. One is how teen pregnancy is a category that's always raced and always classed in particular ways, right? And one of the things that happens when a young person becomes a teen parent, I would just say young girls in particular, is that they lose access to whiteness in a metaphorical sense, right? That to become a teen parent is to lose some of that complicated racial and class privilege. It's very hard to tease apart, right? And the other thing that I talk about in the book is how when we say, or when health promoters say youth sexual health promotion, they already mean teen pregnancy prevention. And that is shifting a bit in this wild world we're living in with COVID, changing the ways the public health is thought about in general. But youth sexual health promotion is always already about teen pregnancy prevention, and teen pregnancy is always already about race. So that was one thing that I was really kind of in analyzing. And I'll say two other things. And one was that I wanted to think about the phenomena in my book and the people in my book queerly in the sense that not identifying as queer people, but to think about the situation with a queer lens or a queer framework. So in many ways, the category of teen pregnancy queers so many things. It queers the idea of family normativity, of capital accumulation, of respectable sexuality, respectable heterosexuality. And so that was that's the second chapter or third chapter in my book that I'm really quite proud of. And then the last thing I'll say is that I was also indebted to and thinking alongside scholars in sociology, like my friend Ghassan Moussaoui, who's not here today, that to think, even if you're doing US-based work, to think transnationally and to think about the effects of imperialism and how that show up in your research. So in this case, it was blaringly, it was not hard to do, right? Because this is this small city known as being, having one of the largest Puerto Rican populations on the mainland. And so to think about Puerto Rico as the US colony in the way that that relationship of imperialism tacitly shows up in the way that white middle-class folks from outside this community do community health work was really useful.
Yeah, and I love that chapter, bringing in queer of color critique and disidentifications and Jose Munoz's work and mess, right? Like the messing up our normative categories. So in line with kind of the theme of this, I thought that was a powerful chapter. And I'm also thinking of the intersections, follow-up question, on your choice of with language and the age as an intersection, because if I recall, many of the those in your book are, when we I think you wrote that they're not the like teens as in 12, 13, but 18 and 19, and this kind of emerging adulthood moment.
Yeah, so this is a good example of this, the social construction of data, right? So when we say teen pregnancy, the epidemiological category is technically 15 to 19, right? But the majority of births that occur in that age range are 18 and 19, meaning they're legally adults, right? But so if you disaggregate that data, the number of young people who get pregnant like 13, 14, 15, 16 is actually quite small. And these numbers have been declining in every US state for many years. So by saying teen, it's a way of reifying this problem, and I think reifying it in racialized and class terms too, that these are not adults, these are children, even though the majority of them are actually adults, right? And so the young women that I worked with in this book use a lot of strategies to separate themselves from the bad teen moms, right? The ones that are not married or don't have a father of their kid in their lives, or use public assistance, or don't have specific goals for after getting a GED, and so on. And teen parent itself is just like a container for a lot of things. And one of the things is not actually about chronological age, right? So much in the way that youth as a concept is very slippery and expansive. And the young women in my book, and some of them identify with the term teen parent, some of them disidentify with it, and some of them straight up reject it, but it's more about a conceptual category than it is an actual age. And so most young parents that are like under 24, especially if you're not married, will kind of see themselves under that larger umbrella of teen or young parent.
Thank you. So we can move on to our next question. So how did feminist praxis inform your approach to your project, whether in the writing or the fieldwork or the initial conceptualization? So again, how did feminist praxis inform your approach?
You want to start?
Any order?
Chris,
Yes.
and then
I just feel like I was talking a lot, so maybe I'll switch.
okay, already I can start. And I will just talk a little bit about the process of developing this, since it was feminist throughout. One, I will say that, and this surprises everybody, but I did not know Whitney more than sort of in passing before we started this project. And we were in agreement, though, that we thought it was a great idea. And there's more on our website that talks about sort of the dinner that happened and all of that. And we put together a proposal in 4 weeks. for this text, never having sort of written together, never having done any of that. And an important part of that, though, was us talking about sort of how we imagined what this edited volume process would be like. And I had experience developing a book series with DC Press, the Reproductive Justice book series. I was working on my own monograph with NYU Press, and Eileen Kalish is awesome, amazing person to work with, really has a feminist sort of approach to working with her authors. And also, when we asked people about edited volumes, number one, people were like, oh, they're a lot of work. And the way to reduce the work is basically to reach out to your friends first, get them to do some stuff, and then if you need to, fill in. And we're like, yeah, that's one way to do it. But if we're trying to model what we think of as a sort of expansive, feminist, inclusive, potentially even radical approach to knowledge production, we needed to do something different. And even though it was going to take absolutely longer, a lot more coordination, a lot more thinking through. And also for us, part of that was, as our just sort of general personal and feminist commitments, Black feminist commitments specifically, is also thinking about mentorship. And so we knew we wanted to have graduate students involved. And so even just in sort of that part of it was conceptualizing, like, as method, how we would put the volume together, and knowing that that would take longer, and this was not the thing that necessarily would get us tenure. Therefore, there's actually, based on the rules of how you get tenure, like, there's more flexibility around that. And so why not use the opportunity to really have it reflect what we would imagine of creating community, of doing that work. And so it was, so that was part of it, but also knowing that what Black feminism means to people can vary. And so we actually did some common readings together before, because I mean, people might assume oh, okay, if you're in sociology and you identify as a Black feminist, of course you've read Pat Hill Collins' Black feminist thought, right? But we also knew that the students who we put out sort of calls at our campuses for, students who might want to be involved with the project, which to us was also about being more transparent and expanding the opportunities, that they might not be as familiar with certain things, right? So we picked a couple texts. We picked Rose Brewer's 1989 article, which many people, she was writing around the same time as Pat Hill Collins and had this whole thing about Black feminist intelligentsia. And we thought that was important. And then also Outsider Within, right? And we read that, we all read that. And then we had our first meeting and talked about it. And we were like, hey, so what do we think about with this? How does this connect to how we think about producing this book? Before we were really, so we were really trying to set the stage and create community and get in a space where we were thinking about power and also just our different perspectives. So we would be able to have that base sort of coming throughout the whole process that we knew was going to be long and might have some challenges to it. So those are some things. I can talk more later in method, but I think that was really something that was important. And having graduate students involved in every sort of event that we've we've presented at ABS and ASA, and we try to use the opportunity, to have the graduate student assistants, although actually one's now Dr. Wright and one's about to be Dr. Kelekay, yeah. But to give them the opportunity to speak about their experience with it, because they were really central to the process for us and also central to the fun, quite frankly. So those are some of the things that we did throughout this process. So.
Thank you, Professor Luna. Professor Taplin-Kaguru.
Yeah, so I would say for this project, it wasn't really something that I went into the field explicitly thinking that was going to be central to the project, and it really emerged from my participants, talking to them about, especially the women I interviewed, about what their hopes for the future were and how they were pursuing it, and the kind of family lineages and dynamics that were all integral to how they were thinking about what kind of home they wanted to be in and how to pursue it. And really, you know, I keep thinking about one of the cases that was really central for me in terms of like figuring out one of the key puzzles in the book was, you know, speaking with a Black woman who was pursuing homeownership, single mother who was living with her own mother, who was providing, you know, a lot of support. There was clearly just a lot of embeddedness in this family relationship that was, you know, enabling a lot of things. It was a major resource for this family to be together in a home, but at the same time, she was grappling with the tension of these kind of broader societal expectations about what it means to be an adult, to be independent in this kind of broader American ideology, and how she needed to pursue that by having her own home for herself and her child. And, you know, in a lot of ways, kind of thinking about what this American ideology meant for my participants, that's where kind of questioning that relationship and what that ideology was doing in my participants' lives, that's where this kind of emerged very much in the field.
Thank you. And Professor Barcelos.
So my this project involved a lot of messy, reflexive insider-outsiderness, and I write about it really explicitly in the first chapter and in the appendix and whenever I talk about it. And so first of all, I want to say insider-outsiderness is a bullshit binary. And I was really influenced by an article by a educational scholar named Wanda Pillow that I read in graduate school. She is trying to get us to reframe this idea of reflexivity as uncomfortable reflexivities. It's not just naming how your intersecting social positions affect the way you view the work or do the work or analyze the work, but also to think about the way that power moves around and the like deep complexities and messiness of that, right? And so that was constantly in my mind as I was doing this work. So I had worked in the city in a professional capacity for many years. I was also a teen parent. I'm a mixed race person that's generally white passing. So in this particular city, the white middle-class professional women saw me as one of them, and the young Latina moms also saw me as one of them. And so it was this like weird fieldwork chameleon situation where everyone would just project their expectations of my identities onto me, and that kind of was not intentional, but as I read through field notes even years later, I'm like, wow, this person is totally making all of these assumptions about my identities, about my politics, about my gender. And so the only way this is how I started bringing queer of color critique into my work, is to think about the messiness of my own racial ethnic ambiguity and queerness and how that showed up in fieldwork in a book. Because most people are more familiar with my work that's about queer and trans communities. And so I was trying to think of how does that work connect with doing this work? And I think it's that uncomfortable, reflexive insider-outsiderness. And that at the end of the day, I was still the person who had a university affiliation and albeit very tiny amounts of grant money to do this work. That all of that is to say that it's really messy, and I don't claim stable truths about the professional stakeholders, the young people in the book, or myself. And like all knowledge, it's messy and slippery, and I think that's actually really generative and productive for thinking about social power, right? So I try to sit with that messiness a lot, and I think I encourage readers to sit with that messiness too.
And I would encourage the audience to check out the appendices or the method sections of our authors here today, as well as the intro for the edited collection, to talk about how this work was done, in terms of negotiating identity in the field, power relations. And so I think we can maybe talk more about that in terms of thinking about how we do this work, how we engage in negotiate different methods, insider outsiderness, racial ambiguity, all of those things. So I don't know what order, but I would love to hear or your thoughts about the decisions you made in the field or in your projects regarding methods. So.
I'll start. Okay, so so one of the big things for me in terms of methods was that I came to the project wanting to understand some more things about suburbs as part of the metropolitan area, and to think about Blackness in the suburbs more, as there have been a few people doing that previously. Definitely was drawing on Karen Lacey's work a lot, but it's definitely something that has been less prominent in the literature on housing, and I was really seeing that was a major place where space and race was really being contested right now in the Chicago metropolitan area. So so that was so basically, in order to do that, I was recruiting participants from homebuyers education classes in a couple different locations, including 2 suburban locations, but to the south, one to the south, and then one to the west of Chicago, which is where there are some Black suburbs and some more racially mixed suburbs. And so in doing that, this project was very much an interview project where I was, following specific home buyers. I did do some kind of limited ethnographic pieces where I was, with people as they were kind of going through some pieces of the home buying process, but it was mostly multiple interviews with specific home buyers talking through, what had happened in their process. And so, there's always limitations to any approach, but what the interview approach allowed me to do was kind of look at a broader geographic expanse in terms of issues of positionality and these kinds of things. I think we're maybe not encouraged to think about that as explicitly when sort of like in the formal interview setting versus in a more kind of ethnographic setting, and where you kind of find out a little bit more about how your positionality is sort of being experienced. I am someone who presents in the world as very racially ambiguous. I'm biracial, Black, white, and present maybe not quite white, but not that Black. And I did have participants ask me about my race, but sometimes, in a formal interview setting, that doesn't come up as much. But one of the things that kind of struck me was speaking on the phone, actually, with a participant who I hadn't gone to interview yet. And she asked me what my race was, in part because she was concerned about me coming to her neighborhood, right? And so this is where this like race and space starts to emerge. And then we talked about, she's like, oh yeah, I have a niece who sounds like you. Okay. So it was like she was then able to place me, and so that was a way in which sort of like my insider outsider kind of status could be interpreted by her. And so there were those kinds of moments, but then also moments when in the messiness of it all, you're not entirely sure how you're being read. And I think I was mostly read from a fairly outsider status, someone, showing up from the University of Chicago who was like sort of odd and not necessarily that connected to Chicago culture. But at the same time, sort of in my own understanding of this work and my own interpretations of it, I come partially from a Black middle class family, and had, some understanding of what it meant to be talking about the American dream and its relationship to a kind of like family legacy and group legacy that, you know, I could see my participants talking about in ways that I could also relate to, but that weren't always the same. And so there's that messiness of bringing your own perspective and trying to understand someone else's as well.
Thank you. Next up, thoughts on methods?
I can go. Yeah. So two things I'm thinking of. In addition to the sort of BS binary of insider outsider, I was also wrestling with the BS binary of studying up and studying down. So the project, as I had originally thought of it, was about from the perspectives of pregnant and parenting youth themselves. And I shifted away from that for a number of reasons. One is to avoid reifying the duty of marginalized people to constantly confess, right? So I was reading a lot of like work and thinking about how, you know, kind of avoiding the poverty porn, right, perspective, right, of, you know, constantly asking marginalized people to share their traumas with researchers, right, which were also a lot of the traumas that I share too, right? So at the time that, you know, doing this research, I'm talking to these young parents who are like living in shelters and I'm getting evicted and like having childcare, you know, so it's like, I sort of shifted away from that, in part also because I wanted to put the focus on how people who hold power and privilege in community health have responsibility is not the right word, but to trace how that power moves around, right? Rather than just the people who are kind of subject to that power, right? But I was also sort of like, you know, I will also say that at the time that, you know, I was reading or researching and writing this, like ethnographies of community health were not as perhaps as marketable, but now all of a sudden people are very interested in how public health gets played out on the local level. So I actually think there's a lot about teen pregnancy prevention that can inform us about COVID. But I also was really important to me that, you know, despite the troubling the idea of voice and whatnot, that the voices and perspectives and worldviews of young parents were part of the book, right? So I wrestled with how to do that, whether to integrate it throughout the book or to put it in a separate chapter. And eventually it ended up sort of that their narratives are mostly in one chapter, but their sort of presence is felt throughout the book, right? As not subjects that are acted upon, but subjects that act. And the second thing I answer this anytime I do a Q&A. I've been answering this question for like a decade now. So I often get asked why the name of the city is pseudonymous in the book. And this is usually accompanied by a bunch of people being like, it's this city. And I'm like, I'm not going to tell you. And they're like, well, it's this one. And I'm like, I'm really not going to tell you. And they're like, well, I know it's this one. And I'm like, there's a reason why it's pseudonymous. And the reason is methodological, right? So, and one was just, it's a small city, right? So it's not, I can't say Chicago and it could be like literally anywhere in Chicago, right? So it's you know, the population is relatively small, it's geographically small. But within community-based health, like any kind of industry, right? Everybody knows each other and there is a lot of tension. And for, you know, certain nonprofit managers or clinicians to be able to speak freely about the politics of their work, they wanted anonymity because they're always competing for grants, for example. And, you know, no one would have spoken to me if they knew that eventually, you know, there would be the bad blood over who got the grant was eventually spilled, right? The other thing, though, I think is even more important is to help avoid reifying the city as the place with the Latina teen pregnancy problem. Like it was so overdetermined as this is what this city is known for, even beyond the region. And so part of that is to say, yes, avoid reifying it as this place with this problem, but that the problems around race and class and gender and economic mobility and how we do community public health are germane to all post-industrial economically segregated or economically and racially segregated American cities, right? So it's not generalizable, but it's transferable in the sense that this is a lot of cities in the United States. And then also to sit with the messy discomfort of not knowing, but everyone thinks they know where it is. And some of them are right, but not all of them.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Oh, yes, yeah. What else can I say on method? I mean, there's a few other things, I guess. One is based on my experience as an author and having help start a book series, I was really thinking about, and we talked about like transparency with people at each stage. And which is why, yes, we had 80 submissions and we were telling people like, hey, here's what we're going to be doing. And so that people would understand, like one, they didn't understand, like there were 80 submissions. Like we cannot possibly publish 80 submissions. Like it just, that's, and I think part of the numbers with the 80 submissions was that we did make a list of sort of our dream list of if we could invite some people to write for this, who would it be? And we had like 40 names and we were like, okay, well, we can't do 40 names. We narrowed it down and all but one said, yes, of course, we'll submit something for your thing. And we're like, really? Okay, that's amazing. And that's like Pat Hill Collins, Dorothy Roberts, and Mignon Moore, and various others. And I think that was partly for many people, they were like, oh, wow, they're already committed to this. And you have a contract, which with edited volumes, those who don't know, sometimes the volumes put together and then they attempt to get a contract. Like, that's a very common way. We did it the other way. And I think that also encouraged some people sort of methodologically in thinking about whether or not they would commit to it. But then also just throughout in working with the authors in helping them develop their chapters, because we saw an abstract and they developed their chapter, and really trying to be mindful of what it's like as a writer to submit your work. And for many people, it's a really vulnerable process. We also had people who were definitely first-time authors, right? Like, and or people who, yes, had written published work previously, but what we were asking was a different style of writing. And that was something that Jody O'Brien, who's the series co-editor for Sociology Rewired, amazing, very supportive, and she had helped with Presumed Incompetent, right? And so she talked about, like, you know, how do we help the authors understand the sort of language we were wanting them to use, the ways that we, yes, be authentic and also convey what we're trying to convey, but also move a little bit away or maybe a lot away from traditional academic convention, or giving them the space to do that, because not everybody was going to want to do that, right? So we were really thinking about that process, and that also meant us also moving beyond some of those aspects. And so that was something that throughout was really part of it. And then I would also say that another thing for us was trying to develop community. And we got the contract in fall 2018. And so there were still some in-person conferences. So throughout, like, once we had the folks who were going to be the authors, like, we would do different gatherings at conferences. So there's some photos on our website of that. And actually in the book, we have some of that, right? Because we're also thinking about the sort of legacy of it, and that, you know, hopefully, you know, 10 years from now, someone's like, oh, who were these people? What were they doing? And we're like, oh, look, part of what we did was gather together for food. Like, that is actually a method, and particularly in communities of color, that's a big thing, right? And like, we want them to do that, right? That we're not just these minds who are putting words on a page, that we are people who are engaging with this experience, engaging with each other, and that sort of represents a Black feminist sort of ethic. And so when I think about method, I think about that for our book. Now, within the chapters, some people are talking about studies that have more sort of traditional methods. Some of them are talking about CBPR. Just, you know, depends. It varies quite a bit. So that was something that was really important throughout and continues to be important throughout. Like, I'm excited I get to meet one of the authors in person here who, you know, we've only engaged via the virtual processes, and we'd never met in person. So I'm like, yay, like, you know, the process continues for us of really engaging with each other and creating this community.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm thinking about your account of this meeting at a restaurant in Philadelphia, ABS, like how that was part of the process of, you know, how this project emerged and came together and solidified. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the time, and maybe we're like halfway through the questions, and I'm so like, you know, curious about the audience questions as well. So maybe we can jump to, like, you know, this one more question, and then then we'll open it up. So this is like a career milestone, you know, having a book out in the world, and it doesn't magically happen. So like, you know, it's exciting, it's challenging. Are there things that kind of helped you complete this work? Do you have advice for people in our audience who are aspiring to like do this work as well? Like maybe some thoughts about completing the project, and then we'll open it up to some questions after that. Yeah. I don't know. Sorry. I'm not...
So my book came out of my dissertation, and I think some things that were really helpful were getting some encouragement to really think of the dissertation as a first draft of the book, rather than thinking of it as just like two completely separate things. And then I'd also say starting my position at Earlham College, which is, you know, this small liberal arts college, I actually found that was a really supportive environment for me to engage in writing, where I was able to just kind of focus on making the book what I wanted it to be, making it accessible. I had students as like readers, basically. I had a couple of work study students who, like, for their work study just read through my book and told me everything that didn't make sense. and that I think was huge for my process. And so being in that kind of space, having like a junior faculty writing group where we exchange drafts, that kind of thing, was great.
Thank you.
I think of this question in terms of the politics of labor. That was all I could really think of, right? So it was making me think a lot about the politics of labor in the academy and the various privileges that we have depending on our institution and that kind of thing. And so I was kind of thinking like, well, what helped me? And I was like, you know, some privilege and some luck being, you know, in my first job in an R1 where I had money that would give me time to write or to index the book. And, you know, just thinking about the way that, you know, inequality structures how we are able to do things in academia was honestly the first thing I thought of. But I will also say that part of what made this book possible was having a public school that I sent my kid to every day for 6 hours, and there was no one bothering me. So I'll say that. He had passed daycare by the time I was writing this, and then finished high school as it came out. But in a more cheerful note, I mean, I'm just always thinking about, like, you know, who is it that gets books published and with what presses and at what point in their career and for what goal, right? So I don't want to pretend like that none of that is germane, but I will say that I had some really wonderful mentors of whom I am so in debt to shepherding me through this kind of process. And I think that's also about the kind of like reproduction of inequality in academia, is who has access to this kind of mentorship, who were they mentored by, what kinds of connections and social capital do they have? And so I find that mentoring is like the very best part of my job. And I think that if you are a new academic book writer, having a mentor who can walk you through that is invaluable, especially because the academic book publishing world is way different than the academic journal publishing world. And there's a lot of unwritten rules that no one tells you about, similar to like, with my undergrads who don't know what office hours are, right? So that kind of capital that they're not socialized into. I think you need to find good mentors to help you with that.
Great, wonderful, thank you.
Yes, yeah, and when I envisioned this question, I was finishing up with my solo book process and know how many people have challenges, even with just like showing up and like writing the words, because they're like, this is nowhere near done. Oh my God, there's so much more. Oh my God, it doesn't matter. Does tenure matter? Does writing matter? Do books matter? You know, and like just giving the opportunity for folks to really talk about that reality, and that there is very much all this politics. And I will say something that with this text, and was really important. And again, it was a different sort of volume, but for us, this was fun, joyous. It was an amazing experience. It was the thing that when a whole bunch of other stuff, which we write about in various terms, different parts in the book about sort of where we were at in our careers, I always enjoyed coming to BFS, right? And I can't say that about my solo monograph, right? Because there was just all these other things that come up with it. Everything from the dissertation defense. I mean, like, you know, even like years later, I can remember certain comments about certain things.
Yeah.
Whereas with this, it was just like, this is just fun and we're excited. And also though, because other people were excited, and that was something that it just, like, we knew it was needed, but also like it just, so many people, like I gave, let's see, Professor Marcelo Cola Martinez, who teaches at Morehouse, assigned the book for the theory class. And so just a couple weeks ago, I was talking with them and I got asked a question about like, oh, was there anyone who was, you know, responding negatively to the fact that you were doing this? And I was like, you know what, there might've been, but like they knew enough to not say anything to us, because the fact is like everybody has been supportive and believed in us in a way. And they talk about this, like we weren't even sure that we were like, well, don't we need a more senior person to lead this? And the senior people we asked were like, no, we think you're going to be doing something great and we think you can handle this. And Jody also was like, no, you're going to be able to do this, right? And so that was something just sort of throughout that was really important about it, but also just that like we also had really good communication. And I think that's really important. Having had some different experiences working with book publishing, I think if you're going to collaborate with someone, you need to be really clear on what your values are. And if you're like, I'm not going to have a conversation on values, then say, okay, because something is going to come up at some point and there's going to be some level of conflict, right? So if you don't have a way to talk about power, if you don't have a way to talk about what's going on, if you don't have a way to talk about what's going on in your lives that might be making impacts on how you're able to meet deadlines or not, or things like that, then it's going to be a really probably painful process. And for something like that, like it just doesn't need to be. I mean, I just don't think it needs to be in any setting, but for something where you're kind of doing a labor of love, like, and really trying to create community, like do that with each other first so that you can model that and do that for others. So I think for me, that's just, it was a really big part of it. And Whitney and I and multiple, you know, and the grad editors and others, you know, we got to know each other a little bit more throughout the process, more about each other's styles. And that was just a really big part of it. And it was sort of weird and sad when it was time to submit those final proof. I mean, it was exciting as well, but it was also like, oh, wow, we've been working on this for so long. Like, and what's next? Oh my God, you know? And so that to me was a sign of success with the process and what it meant. Like for us, it wasn't just about the writing, it was about creating the relationships in the community. So.
Well, thank you very much. And so we have some time for questions, but before we do that, a round of applause for our panelists and their books. So I think we have about 10 to 15 if we go a little over, questions from the audience. Rather than, I guess, me walking around, I can repeat the question if there are some, so that we have it on the mic as well. We can open up to questions for the audience, from the audience. Yes.
About stigmatization of intergenerational households. And yeah, I feel like it was really key for my book. It was actually one of the ways that I was kind of able to open things up and see how the American dream itself was a draw to home ownership, and able to kind of disentangle the kind of like perceived financial benefits of home ownership from the social standing benefits of home ownership, because sometimes people were very explicit about like making choices that were, you know, going to cost them financially, because it was about like achieving this social standing. And you could see it when people were talking about like leaving the intergenerational household. But one of the things that was, I think, really great about doing these open-ended qualitative interviews was that I could get kind of the multiple narratives and the ways that people were talking about, even if there were going to be multiple houses, that those intergenerational units were still going to be important to them. And so that factored into, where people were looking for homes, right? Because they needed something that was going to facilitate a kind of like extra household network of care, going, yes, like multiple ways in terms of caring for older adults, but then also maybe a grandparent generation helping with care for children. And that this was, an important resource for family resiliency, financially, socially, and just in terms of love and care and, important family relationships.
Okay, great. Do we have any other questions? Maybe I'll bring the mic to so that we don't have to repeat them. Yes, okay. Give me one moment. All right.
Price is right. This is Naomi Joseph, one of my great graduate students who's working on social movements. Yes.
Oh, hi. Thank you all for your presentation and for the incredible books you've written. My question is especially, obviously, Mr. Luna has mentioned that I'm advisee, so I'm actually going to direct this to the other two panelists who I don't get to work with as often, or haven't worked with. I'm interested in, you've talked about this a little bit, but I wonder if you could spend a little bit more time talking about the experience of studying and researching groups of people who are racialized in a different way than you are. Because you've talked about kind of this complicated insider-outsiderness, and it makes a lot of sense to question that as a binary. It also seems very situational, as you both have talked about. So I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about it at the beginning stages of the process of conceptualizing your project. To what extent you thought about that versus like kind of responding to it in the moment, and how you, if you were able to think about that before getting into the project, how did that affect the design, if at all? Thank you.
I guess I'll go first since you just spoke. That's a tough question. This project, hard to answer about it temporally because like many projects, they evolve in ways you don't necessarily anticipate. So I would say that it was not as much that my engagement with that messiness grew as the project went on, and I was, progressing or maturing in my own kind of analyses and scholarship, and especially in the way that I think actually what I will say is that it was going outside the discipline that helped me do that work, right? So it's like women of color feminisms and Black feminisms and Chicana feminisms and all of that like asks us to do this work, whereas in like sociology as a whole, it's like you are the objective neutral researcher who will study these people and tell us the truth, right? And so I think it was like reading outside, and I also like I call myself a humanistic social scientist because I often straddle the line between the humanities and social sciences. And so I think it was that looking outside the social sciences and really at feminist theories, women of color feminist theories, that enabled me to be like, no, that's bullshit. You are not this neutral to, like, that's bullshit. Get rid of that now. Start thinking about race and racialization. This is what this is all about. Is that kind of what you were asking? Okay.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really good question. And in terms of sort of like my own positionality, in a lot of ways, I feel like it's just more similar to just my whole life experience. Because like I'm very used to being a person who like physically stands out in a particular space. My brother and I are immediately racialized is very different. You know, I just kind of like grew up with questions about that all the time. You know, I'm used to being in Black spaces where I'm the lightest person there. I'm used to being in white spaces where I'm the darkest person. It's just, that's just normal life to me. And I'm, you know, constantly having conversations with people who are trying to figure out what my race is. And that's just normal life to me. And so I feel like for those reasons, I probably under theorized what it meant for the interview situation. And I think that that's something that I should think about more in future projects.
Write an article about it.
Yeah.
All right, great. So I think we have time for one more quick question if anyone has one. Anyone else in the audience? All right.
Sangitamo, good morning. How did you shop for your publisher? And how did that, you know, what was the best fit? How did you guys go about it? What was your process? Thank you.
Sure, I will say that I will give thanks to ABS and Association of Black Sociologists. And at the time when Marcus Anthony Hunter, he was developing a relationship with Routledge and being very intentional, right? Wanting to think about ways that Black sociologists could be brought into more of the sort of publishing networks. And one way was through a sort of formal relationship with Routledge. And it just happened that that year, which was the year that like ASA was doing the whole feeling race thing. Like that was the formal topic. There's always feelings of race at ASA, but formally that was the, and so then ABS was doing a whole bunch on legacy. And so Dorothy Roberts was there, Pat Hill Collins was there. And there was a retrospective with Pat Hill Collins because Black Feminist Sociology is now published by, you know, Routledge. And we literally, you know, having a conversation, having a dinner, and then emailing and saying, hey, Marcus and Zandria was president-elect, like, we want to do a Black Feminist Sociology volume. So let's just make sure, like, we want to talk with you about that at some point. And the response was like, great. That, okay. And we did email a bit about sort of what else would be entailed in the process, but basically they'd done quite a bit of work to develop a relationship already. And then Dean Berkenkamp, who was at the conference, was supportive. And then Whitney and I like met once and like by Zoom. This was pre-pandemic. And we came up with our process for how we would develop our book proposal, which was like, let's go separately for a few weeks, write what we had imagined for this, and then come together and see what happens. And it was, again, unusual. It's never happened like this for me before. Don't know it ever will again, but we were basically like, great, we can merge these. We're working really similarly and thinking very similarly. And we met with Dean a few days later, and I think he was surprised that we had already done the proposal fully. And was like, yes, I'm excited by this. Let's talk about just a couple things. And then we had a contract and we did a little bit of negotiation. Yeah. So, I mean, that was a relatively quick process. And I think it helps when we talk about the broader context, like, you know, Black feminism was hot, right? People were super excited by Black feminism when we were developing the volume. And I mean, like, sort of broadly culturally, there was just a whole bunch going on. And so one acknowledged the work of others that was getting attention, whether it's Brittany Cooper's or many others, and then Kim Kenshaw on intersectionality. So there was also this other thing, like Routledge is also is a for-profit press. So that's also something that, I mean, it factors in for all presses. And I say this having helped develop a series at UC Press, factors in for all presses, but it factors in a little differently for a press like Routledge. And luckily, I'd already had some experience with NYU Press. And so there were some things I needed to ask about coming in with experience with two different not-for-profit presses as we went into this experience with Routledge, and also asked some people who had they'd done the Birthing Justice edited volume, Alicia Bonaparte and Julia Sudbury, they had edited that volume. So we also asked them about working with Routledge and what was important to think about as far as resources or things like that. So that was a little different than the process for solo monograph, I will say. But, yeah.
Thank you. And I think we're getting close to time, but maybe a brief response, and then we can wrap it up for the next session, the plenary. So great.
Yes, I can be really brief. So Dean is also my editor. And this was my first book. I really didn't know what I was doing. I, had a little proposal that I sent off to a whole bunch of different presses. And then it was like a friend of a friend who had published with Routledge who sent like an introduction for me. And that's what kind of, I think, really made it happen with Routledge. I think that's really networks. Yeah, they matter.
That's exactly what I would say. And that was the thing I mentioned earlier. Journal publishing is a whole different, book publishing is a whole different set of unwritten rules, and you are not anonymous. It's all about who you know. And so you need often a mentor or a colleague to send the proposal.
Although I will say, having been, it doesn't guarantee it though. So that's also something important. With the presses, like it doesn't guarantee, it can help get attention.
Yeah.
But also I will say something I did also see nicely at UC at times was that if someone was really into the proposal, like somehow it got to that, like they did stand by it. Now, of course, though, there's those politics of that I think is really important and frustrating about how things do get to editors, and like we're on a live stream, that's no secret, right? So happy to talk more about that off the live stream, but yeah, that is the important part.
And part of the goal of the book salon is to demystify the process, right?
Yes,
and so
exactly.
hopefully the SWS meeting can help, all of us know more about how to do this type of work. So again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all the audience. I will say that our authors have generously agreed to donate a copy of their book to the SWS silent auction, maybe even signed. Thank you again to our panelists, and please stick around for the first plenary session, Feminist Mobilizing for Better Futures, a Transnational Perspective, which will start at I think 10 a.m. So please join me with one last round of applause for our panelists. Congratulations on the publication of your book.